Hi folks, my name is Dave and welcome to my 7th and final video on a series of Jordan and Israel. And today we are all about the city of Jerusalem. It's an incredible city with historical and biblical significance that no other city can rival. The world's most trusted source of information, Wikipedia, states that throughout Jerusalem's long history, it has been destroyed twice, besieged 23 times, captured and recaptured 44 times, and attacked over 50 times. And earlier this year, as of the release date of this video, Palestine had attacked Israel once again. So if there's one thing you could take to the bank, Jerusalem and Israel will continue to be attacked. And with the current Iranian nuclear deal on the world's political table, it's going to heat up again pretty quick. But enough about the political theater around Israel and Jerusalem for now. We could dedicate an entire video series just on that subject alone, right? So let's start this video off at an incredible place just east of Jerusalem on a hill they call the Mount of Olives. This was one of the places I was most excited about when we made our plans for visiting Israel. So much biblical history took place right here, including King David escaping to the Mount of Olives from his son Absalom, Jesus teaching his disciples from here, and then riding a donkey into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, the Garden of Gethsemane at the base of the Mount of Olives, and of course, Christ's Ascension. The Kidron Valley runs north and south between the Mount of Olives and the eastern wall of the Temple Mount and the City of David. In Jesus' time, the Mount of Olives was connected to Jerusalem by 4 bridges or ramps over the Kidron River. The Kidron River is mentioned 11 times in the Old Testament, so there must be something pretty significant about this area. The river is dry today, but after a good rain or a flash flood, you can see it come to life once again. The Kidron Valley is where the common folk of Israel were buried, and where King Jehoshaphat overthrew the enemies of Israel. This is also where the Levites would throw away their unclean and defiled items. The Levites were aides to the priests, and they had lots of bloody, defiled items to dispose of. So, the Kidron Valley became kind of a dumping ground. The Kidron Valley is full of modern and ancient graves and monuments. Ancient monuments like Absalom's pillar are found here. Now remember, he's not buried here. He was killed by Joab when his hair got stuck in a tree. Joab threw him into a pit and buried him in a pile of rocks after trying to overthrow his father, King David. There's also Zechariah's tomb and Ben-Hazir's tomb, to name a few here in the Kidron Valley. Today, Jerusalem is a very crowded city and real estate is at a premium, and yet there are places in the Kidron and Ben Hinnom valleys that are still undeveloped. Nobody wants to build there. This is where children were sacrificed to Baal and Moloch thousands of years ago. When David talks about the Valley of Death, this is what was going through his mind. When he escaped Jerusalem from being overthrown by his own son Absalom, he fled through this valley to the Mount of Olives and said, "I will fear no evil, for you are with me." That's Psalm 23. However, in Jeremiah 31, Jeremiah prophesied that the whole valley of dead bodies and ashes, the whole valley of death, will now be a new beginning when Christ returns. So even something that has been related to death for thousands of years, God is able to turn that into new life. On top of the Mount of Olives, you can see the entire city of Jerusalem. Of course, a lot has changed over the centuries, but then again, a lot of things haven't changed, so you can easily imagine what once was. The Dome of the Rock dominates for your attention, but it's built over the same place as the first and second temples. And with the city walls still intact, you get a pretty good feel for what the city might have looked like back in biblical times. Back in Jesus' time, the retaining walls actually spread out much further. Today, this eastern wall ends at the Temple Mount, but some 2,000 years ago, it extended out to the other side of the Valley of Ben Hinnom, which is right here. And then the walls extended up and around from there. Now for a spoiler alert, the retaining walls around the Temple Mount were built by King Herod of Jesus' time, with the Western or Wailing Wall being the most famous. But all the buildings you see inside the walls of Jerusalem were built after Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. The Jerusalem of Jesus' time is actually 30 to 40 feet below today's Jerusalem. It reminds me of the city of Seattle. The city actually burned to the ground in 1889, and the Seattle we know today was rebuilt on top of the old ruins. Well, the same is true for the old city of Jerusalem. It was leveled in 70 AD. From this vantage point on the Mount of Olives, there's a 6,000-year history lesson staring right at us. The Temple Mount is the plaza area that is surrounded by retaining walls that the city of Jerusalem is known for. It's approximately 150,000 square meters or 37 acres. The Dome of the Rock, which currently sits where the first and second temple were located, was built by the Muslims in 692 AD. So what's under the Dome of the Rock? The rock of what? Well, let's check out Genesis 22 verse 2, where God tests Abraham's faith and tells him to travel to Moriah with his son Isaac and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. As we know, Abraham did what he was told and built an altar for the sacrifice, but God stepped in and provided a ram for the sacrifice instead of his son Isaac. Now let's jump to 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1, where Solomon begins to build the first temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. Seems like the same place, doesn't it? Well, what's under the Dome of the Rock is the altar where Abraham was asked to slay his son. How cool is that? And because of Abraham's obedience, he became the father of all who believe, according to Romans 4:16. To add credence to this location, let's back up a few years to when Solomon's father David was king. David had ordered a census to be taken throughout Israel. Now, the only reason he would do this is that he didn't trust God to overcome his enemies, so he wanted to know how many fighting soldiers he had. Well, God was not happy with David and gave him 3 punishments to choose from. David wouldn't choose, so God sent a plague throughout Israel that killed 70,000 people in 3 days. God had sent a death angel to destroy Jerusalem, and just as he was about to do that, an angel of the Lord appeared above the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite and stopped the devastation. David was then instructed to build an altar here on this threshing floor. The second part of that verse in 2 Chronicles states, the temple was built on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So, both the altar that Abraham built and the altar that David built are here in this location. Now, interestingly enough, the Muslims do have a claim to this site as well. Abraham had another son, Ishmael, through a maidservant named Hagar. Hagar and Ishmael were banished from Abraham's home when Ishmael was young due to a conflict between Hagar and Sarah, Abraham's wife. God told Abraham that he would make a nation from Ishmael's descendants as well, and today, Ishmael is known as the forefather of the Arab nations. Remember that 6,000-year history lesson we were looking at? Well, let's jump ahead about 1,000 years to the time of Jesus. From the Mount of Olives, you can see the southern stairs where Jesus most likely would have entered the Temple Mount. In Jesus' time, this is where the portico was built, and most likely where Jesus turned over the tables of the money changers. We can see Caiaphas' house, the high priest. The little white dome is where the rich folk lived, and where Jesus was taken after being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, which is located at the bottom of the Mount of Olives to the right of where we are at. You can also see Pontius Pilate's house. Now, it's currently the Al-Omariya High School where the Antonia Fortress once stood, which housed the Roman guard where tribunals were held. The first Station of the Cross on the Via Dolorosa is in this high school. The Garden Tomb is located just below this antenna here, and you can see the East Gate, also known as the Golden Gate or the Gate of Mercy. This gate has been sealed and unsealed several times throughout history, with the final closure by the Ottoman Empire in 1541. Some 2,000 years earlier, Ezekiel had a vision from God that took him into the future where he saw the East Gate sealed up. He was told in chapter 44, verse 2 and 3, that it would never be opened again. For the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered here. This gate is for the prince, and he shall enter by the way of the porch of that gate. Folks, this is describing Jesus entering Jerusalem upon his return. It doesn't matter how much concrete they poured into these gates to keep them shut. They are about to blow wide open. Now, to blow your minds even more on what's going to take place on the day Christ returns, let's take a look at Zechariah 14, verses 1 through 9. This is talking about Jesus' return, and I quote, "On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will split apart, making a wide valley running east to west. Half the mountain will move toward the north, and half toward the south. You will flee through this valley, for it will reach across to Azal. Then the Lord will come, and all his holy ones with him. On that day, the sources of light will no longer shine, yet there will be continuous day. There will be no normal day and night, for at evening time it will still be light. On that day, life-giving waters will flow out from Jerusalem, half towards the Dead Sea and half toward the Mediterranean, flowing continuously in both summer and winter." Unquote. All right, here's the Bible according to Dave. You ready? All right, so I see, this is the movie I have playing in my mind right now, okay? I see Christ descending on the Mount of Olives. Immediately, half the Mount of Olives moves to the north, half moves to the south. And the Bible says it creates a huge valley. So we know it's not like a little 3-foot sidewalk that Jesus is going to meander up to the east gate, right? So in my mind, I just see this huge destruction going all the way up to the east gate, blowing the east gate apart, okay? And Christ can just like walk right on through. Now, Jesus doesn't need a clear pathway. He can walk through walls. So again, this is just what's going through my mind. So now the cool part is this valley that's created, this huge valley, goes all the way to the Dead Sea in the east, goes all the way west to the Mediterranean Sea. That becomes the river basin for all this water flowing out in the middle of Jerusalem. Okay, this huge spring is going to develop, and it's going to run all year long to the west and to the east, using that valley as a river basin. Now that's pretty cool. The Garden of Gethsemane can be accessed from the top of the Mount of Olives by walking down a road on the north side of the cemetery. This is a very cool walk. Looking out over this Jewish cemetery, which began over 3,000 years ago, it's just an amazing sight. This cemetery contains somewhere between 100,000 to 150,000 graves. There are many Jewish folk traditions about the virtues of being buried on the Mount of Olives. But the number one benefit is, those who are buried here will be the first to be resurrected on the day the Messiah comes to earth. Since many Jews believe that they will be resurrected when the Messiah comes through the east gate, those with deep pockets have been buried as close to the gate as possible so they can be the very first to enter the new kingdom. At the bottom of this road, we come to the Garden of Gethsemane. You know, there's a lot of surreal moments and places throughout Jerusalem and Israel. Being in the literal spot where Jesus was in such agony that he sweat drops of blood. The place where Judas betrayed him and handed him over to the temple guard. The place where Jesus was arrested the night before his crucifixion. It's incredible to think that we're standing right here. This is a very peaceful and serene garden. It's the kind of place where you just like to sit and ponder for a while. And then you're surrounded by all these incredible olive trees. The average olive tree lives about 500 years, but many have survived well over 1,500 years. In 2011, the olive tree with the wheelbarrow next to it was dying, so an expert from the Hebrew University was called in to save the tree if at all possible. As olive trees get older, they get hollow in the inside. So they took a dead piece from the inside of the tree to a laboratory and found that it was there during Jesus' time. It is over 2,000 years old, and it's still living. The Gospels tell us that Jesus asked his disciples to pray here, and then he walked about a stone's throw away to pray by himself. Well, About a stone's throw away from here is where the Church of All Nations, also known as the Basilica of the Agony, stands, which was built by Antonio Barluzzi in 1924. This church is built over the rock where it is believed to be the place Jesus prayed, "Not my will, but thine be done." Now that passage is very interesting. Many of us have been taught that when Jesus prayed, "Let this cup of suffering be taken away from me," he was asking God to stop what was about to take place. I'm going to give you another point of view that I heard from the prophet Robin Bullock. What we tend to skip over is that Jesus thought he was going to die in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus said his soul was crushed with grief to the point of death. Jesus knew all along that the plan for him was to die on the cross. He didn't want to die in the Garden of Gethsemane. So in essence, he was saying, "Father, Dad, I don't want to die here. That's not the plan. But if that's your will, so be it. But I want to make it to the cross." See, he knew all the pain, all the suffering, all the torment that he was about to go through in the next 24 hours or so. He wanted to take all those stripes. He wanted to take those nails for us on the cross. That's how much he loves us. He wanted to make it to the cross for us. Once inside the Church of All Nations, it's impossible not to notice the atmosphere of heaviness and darkness. The architects did a great job recalling the grief and sorrow that Jesus experienced here. Towards the front of the church is the rock of agony Jesus prayed on. There was a service taking place while we were there, so we were unable to get a close-up view, but we were able to catch a glimpse. The vault of the church is decorated with palm trees and olive branches. Again, the architects did a great job of bringing the Garden of Gethsemane inside the building. One of the most recognizable places inside Jerusalem is the Western Wall. In its glory days, this wall stood nearly 200 feet high and was 1,600 feet long. What we see today are the remains of the Western Wall after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, which now is just 230 feet in length above ground and about 130 feet tall at its highest point. However, via tunnels, you can explore those 1,600 feet underground, which we will do next. For a religious Jew, this is as close as they can get to where the temple was. They don't go up to the Temple Mount because they don't want to step on holy ground. They don't know where it is. For me, experiencing this is something that I've known about and heard about all my life. And to be standing next to it is nothing short of amazing. If you've ever traveled to Europe, you've seen old buildings, but nothing comes close to this wall. The engineering behind it is incredible, as these stones weigh over 600 tons apiece. And to still be standing today is remarkable. When King David purchased Mount Zion with the goal of building the first temple, Mount Zion was just a piece of land 750 feet square, or around 13 acres. That temple, built by his son Solomon, lasted 400 years until Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it in 586 BC. The Second Temple was built 70 years later by the Jews who had just come back from being held captive in Babylon. Those Jews had very little money, so the original building was very modest. The Maccabees kings and Herod the Great would renovate this temple around 37 BC by expanding Mount Zion to include the construction of these 4 huge retaining walls, a temple with a royal portico, and all the colonnades, etc. This is the temple that Jesus saw. In 70 AD, this temple was completely destroyed by the Romans, leaving only the 4 retaining walls. 1,300 years later, Muslims built the Dome of the Rock up on the Temple Mount, which was completed around 962 AD. The underground tours available throughout this city are a time tunnel to ancient Jerusalem, and the Western Wall Tunnel is no exception. These tunnels were opened right after the Six-Day War in the early 70s with the purpose of allowing the Jews to be as close to the Holy of Holies as possible and to walk where their ancestors walked. The first thing we find as we enter the underground tour is a large room. A gathering place, or perhaps a church at one time? I don't know, but it's a pretty cool artifact, and it's still being used today for various events. A little further down the tunnel, we find ourselves beneath the first arch of the aqueduct that carried water into Jerusalem. This aqueduct started 80 miles south on the mountain of Hebron and was engineered with a 3% slope all the way back to Jerusalem. Below this arch is a large mikveh. Now, there are several mikvehs or ritual baths used for purification along this tour. A mikveh needed to be filled with living water, not water from a well, and these mikvehs were filled by a nearby spring. Purity versus impurity was a huge topic in Jesus' day. We came upon a mikveh that was closed by a gate. Now, this particular mikveh had been open to the public for years until two elderly folks were baptized here. Naked. Folks, as a public service announcement, I feel like I need to tell everyone on these tours to keep your clothes on at all times. And I think everyone on our tour knows who I'm talking about, but I'm not going to name names. Fred. There's a room from Jesus' time that is still being used today for special events. This room used to have a big circular waterfall as water fell from pipes high above, spaced every 3 to 4 feet, all around the top of the room. Walls and columns have been added since Jesus' time, so imagine this area being only a third the size of what it used to be. Keep in mind that in Jesus' time, you would have seen the beautiful sky above. What a great place to come fill your water vessels, as well as feeling the excitement of being this close to the temple. As I just mentioned, it is believed that this was the location of a huge waterfall in the middle of Jerusalem. I also mentioned a few moments ago that when Jesus returns, there will be a huge water source in the middle of Jerusalem that will flow to the Mediterranean Sea in the west and the Dead Sea to the east. Could this same water source be activated once again? It seems like we could be in the right location. How cool would that be? After walking several minutes through the tunnel, we come to the priest gate, known as the Warren Gate, which led directly to the Temple Mount. In the year 1099 AD, Jerusalem was captured by the Crusaders. The Jewish priests were hiding in this room during the attack, but were discovered by the Crusaders, who blocked the door and set the synagogue on fire, providing no escape. Further down the tunnel, we come to what is known as the Wall Street, which during Jesus' time connected this road to the Pool of Siloam. Directly above us is the Station of the Cross number 5 on the Via Dolorosa. The floor we are standing on is the actual floor Jesus walked on before his crucifixion. Towards the end of the tunnel, we come upon the Stirthian Pool, which translated from the Greek means Pool of the Sparrow. Now again, you have to imagine this pool with wide open skies above. Herod built these massive arches to support the city he was building overhead. Directly above this pool today is the Convent of the Sisters of Zion. This was an awesome tour and one that you may miss if you don't know about it. You never know what incredible history is waiting for you just 30 feet below ground. Once you're back above ground, there are many tours and sights to see in Jerusalem. One of those is the Israel Museum. This museum contains an archaeological wing, a Jewish art gallery, the Shrine of the Book, which contains real Dead Sea Scrolls, an art garden, and, where we are going to start off, a 1/50th scale model of Second Temple Jerusalem time. This work of art is amazing. The detail of each model piece is superb and highlights the architecture of that time. This view would be as if we're standing on the Mount of Olives looking down over the city to the west. Now, how do they know what Jerusalem looked like back then? Well, from the biblical narratives in the Old and New Testaments, along with the historical records by Josephus and other ancient writings, and of course findings from excavations, we can know pretty well how Jerusalem used to look in Second Temple times. It was a typical Roman city, and all Roman cities had the exact same structure and the exact same facilities. However, the model builders will be the first to tell you this is not what Jerusalem looked like during the Second Temple period. Why would they say this? Well, with continuous archaeology, new knowledge changes the reality of what this city looked like. This model gets regular updates as more discoveries are made. So the next time you see this, it may look a little bit different. The temple in Jerusalem was the largest temple in the Roman Empire. Herod the Great wanted to have the Jewish people's support, as well as impressing his Roman friends, and he kept everyone busy. The temple was the heart of the Jewish people, but also the heart of the world. Jews and non-Jews alike contributed to the funding of this temple. As we saw when we were on the Mount of Olives, you can see the Eastern Gate located on the model. The Eastern Gate was used only one day each year on the Day of Atonement. A scapegoat was released through this gate to be released to Azazel, the leader of the fallen angels, taking with it all of the sins and impurities of the people. We just mentioned Azazel in Zechariah 14 during Christ's return. This view of the model is from the south looking north, where you can see the spring of Gihon and the Kidron River. The Jewish grave sites we see on the Mount of Olives today was once a beautiful terraced hillside where Solomon planted his cedar and spice trees. You can easily see the geography and elevations of the city in this view. The poor people lived on the slope of the city, whereas the who's who of Jerusalem lived up above. The central valley or heart of the city can be seen here. It was the central marketplace of the city. The pool of Siloam can be seen at the foot of the city of David. This is where Jesus healed the blind man by placing mud on the blind man's eye. We'll get a close-up look at this pool in just a bit, but an interesting update, it has recently been discovered that the pool of Siloam was actually 6 times larger than what is seen in this model. So, expect to see it changed next time we're here. Our next stop at the Israel Museum is the Shrine of the Book. This was built as a repository for the first 7 Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran in 1947. The unique white dome over the shrine resembles the lids of the jars in which the first scrolls are found in Qumran, and the corridor leading into the shrine resembles a cave. It's a pretty cool design. Once inside, there are many glass cases displaying various pages, but the centerpiece resembles a giant Torah scroll. Due to how fragile these scrolls are, they are cycled out on a regular basis to avoid deterioration. The shrine houses the Isaiah scroll, dating back to 2nd century BC, which is the most intact of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it also contains a medieval-bound manuscript of the Hebrew Bible from 10th century AD, known as the Aleppo Codex. It's the oldest existing Hebrew Bible known to man. It's incredible to think that these discoveries took place just 75 years ago, and that these scrolls verify the accuracy of the Bible today. You know that feeling where you just need to get out of the big city? Well, that can even happen in Jerusalem. You know, you're smack in the middle of the hustle and bustle, dealing with crazy tourists all day long. Well, just a short 20-minute drive east of Jerusalem, we find ourselves at Genesis Land, right in the middle of the Judean desert. You can camp overnight here, take workshops on pita baking, pottery making, and even learn ancient Hebrew writings. But today, we're taking a camel ride back in time some 4,000 years to have lunch with Abraham. Yes, that Abraham. I have to admit, the most entertaining part of this day was watching people get on and off their camels. It's kind of like being locked and loaded into a catapult. Lean as far back as possible, and then the camel will hurl you forward like you're getting rear-ended by a semi. So as long as you're prepared for all that, you'll do just fine. Unfortunately, I think I headbutted the poor guy trying to assist us while attempting to dismount. Now I'll be the first to admit I need to lose a few pounds, but when I came to, I looked over at our camel and I thought this was just poor sportsmanship. After taking a short walk down a dirt road, we were suddenly at Abraham's tent, being greeted by Abraham himself. And I gotta tell you, he looked great for his age. We were given a very nice welcome.
My dear guests, I thank you for the huge undertaking you've just taken. Coming back 3,800 years was not easy, was it?
No.
You're most probably a little tired. You'll get water to pour over your hands and it will wake you up, yes? Yes?
Yes.
After allowing us to clean up from our journey, we were ushered into the tent where Abraham had prepared a delicious lunch for us. Abraham proceeded to tell us his story from long ago, and that his father Terah made idols for a living, and that God had persuaded Abraham to leave his father and his father's business, and that God would bless him with descendants that would outnumber the stars in the sky. Well, we were blessed to spend time with Abraham, and he and his wife Sarah filled our hearts with joy and our stomachs with an awesome spread. And I think it's only fitting that our camel named Matilda should give us the last word. The next adventure we're heading to is the city of David. On our way there, the Valley of Gehenna, or Valley of Ben Hinnom, appears outside our bus window on the west side of Jerusalem. Earlier, I had mentioned the Ben Hinnom Valley as the Valley of Death. As you can see, the upper part of this valley has been transformed into a beautiful park-like setting with expensive townhomes above, and even a concert venue has been added. But you can only cover up so much. As the Ben Hinnom Valley turns towards the south and gets closer to joining the Kidron Valley, the true colors and paths of this valley are exposed. It soon turns into no man's land where conflict continues to reign between Israel and Palestine. The city of David is located just south of the Dung Gate in Old Jerusalem. As you enter, you are welcomed by rows of beautiful flowers and amazing views. It's a great place to just sit, relax, and enjoy a great cup of coffee. And if this coffee company isn't called Holy Grounds, then somebody completely missed the boat. We were reminded that King David wanted to unite the tribes of Judah in the south and the tribes of Benjamin in the north, as Jerusalem was located right in the middle. Believe it or not, King Saul's daughter Michal was a key player in this. We forget that she was King David's first wife. 2 Samuel 6, 13 through 16 is about David bringing the Ark of the Covenant into this Jerusalem right here. There was a huge celebration, and David danced with all his might before the Lord, and perhaps looked a little foolish in the process. Michal, however, wasn't having any of it, and she stayed in her room and despised him in her heart. Now, before we jump all over Michal, consider this. Here's a woman whose father, Saul, used her as a political bargaining chip and tried to involve her in assassinating her own husband, David. And when that didn't work, Saul gave her away to another man when David was in hiding. Once David was in power, he demanded Michal back. But did she still love David? Did she still love the other man? So who knows where she was emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and even physically. What we do know is that she never had a child, and the Bible doesn't tell us why that was. But had there been a child between the reign of Saul and the reign of David, that would have brought those tribes back together again. But unfortunately, that unity did not take place under David's reign. And in fact, after his son Solomon's death, the kingdom soon split apart. The story of Michael is a sad one, but also a great reminder that we shouldn't judge a book by its cover or a person by a specific behavior, because we don't know what chapter was recently written on that person's life. And especially today, we need to approach everybody with love and compassion, regardless of what we see on the outside. This is ancient Jerusalem, where the early Canaanite settlers diverted water from the Gihon Spring, located just a few hundred yards away from here, into pools and channels to be used for irrigation. About 3,800 years ago, they dug what we know today as the Canaanite Tunnel, which allowed safe passage for their people to the water. In 2 Chronicles 32, we read that King Hezekiah built his own tunnel in 8 BC and blocked up the flow of water into the Canaanite tunnel for protection against his enemies. Now, water still flows through his tunnel today, and as a tourist, you can walk through either tunnel depending on whether you feel like getting wet or prefer to stay dry. Both of these tunnels lead to the Pool of Siloam, which we'll visit next, but let's talk about David and Bathsheba, probably one of the most famous Bible stories that took place right here. The town directly across from us, where the Kidron and Hinnom valleys meet, is called Siloam, and today it's a Palestinian neighborhood. You can see the Mount of Olives to your left, and you can get a feel for the path that David had to take to escape from his son Absalom. Now, these aren't the same houses that were here 3,000 years ago, but you can see how close they are to David's palace. This is where Bathsheba's house was located. You know, the world tries to twist Bible stories into making us believe the opposite of what's written in the Bible. One such case is this story. People believe that Bathsheba was taking a bath on the roof of her house. Now, there's a line in Leonard Cohen's song Hallelujah that completely perverts this story. As our guide Iran would say, that would have caused riots. Nobody did that in Jerusalem. The facts are, the Bible is very critical of David's behavior in 2 Samuel chapter 11. He sent his army off to war, but decided he was going to stay home. Kings did not do that. Then it describes David getting out of bed late in the afternoon. Who knows what was going on the night before. Then it describes David up on his rooftop, looking over to where Siloam is today. What is he doing up there? Keep in mind, the roof on his palace was much higher than where we are standing. Now, people did take baths outside in those days, but everyone had a walled courtyard, and the only way anyone could see someone taking a bath was if they had a bird's eye view. Insert King David. As we know, he sent for Bathsheba, she got pregnant, and King David did everything he could to cover up his dirty deed, including having her husband killed in battle. But you can't hide from God, and David's confession after being confronted by the prophet Nathan is the very heart that God is seeking in each one of us. David did horrible things, but he confessed his sins and God forgave him and blessed him. Yes, there is a price to pay, and we have to face our own consequences for our sinful behavior, but there is mercy, grace, and redemption on the other side. Well, as promised, after a short walk from exiting the Canaanite tunnel, we find ourselves at the foot of the Pool of Siloam. Up until 1996, everyone thought the Pool of Siloam was located up the hill a bit from here at the end of Hezekiah's tunnel. However, in 1996, a sewage pipe broke in this location. Because of the archaeological richness all around Jerusalem, a team was sent in to see if there was anything buried here before the pipe could be repaired. And sure enough, the real Pool of Siloam appeared. Remember when we were looking at the scale model of Jerusalem a few moments ago and mentioned the Pool of Siloam being larger than they first thought? Well, it actually extended over across the valley in front of us to where the residential houses now stand. It was big. In Jesus' time, this was the #1 baptismal pool in Jerusalem. As people made their pilgrimage to Jerusalem, they would walk up through the Kidron Valley, come here to be baptized, and then continue up to the city where they could purchase their sacrifices and head over to the southern stairs to enter the temple. The biblical story that took place here is about the man Jesus healed who was blind from birth. Jesus put mud on his eyes and told him to go wash his eyes in the pool of Siloam. Of course he did, and the blind man could see. This story is found in the Gospel of John, chapter 9, and one of the most amazing parts is that several of his neighbors didn't recognize him after being with Jesus. In fact, his parents were brought before the Jewish leaders to ask if he was their son, because they weren't sure. Here's Pastor Ray to talk about life change when we encounter Jesus.
So he's been healed. He goes back home and he goes back into his culture, into his home. He goes back to people he knew and they didn't recognize him because something had been changed. But we all know what that was, right? He'd been in the presence of Jesus. And anytime you're in the presence of Jesus, how many think there ought to be life change? There has to be life change.
Let's continue this pilgrimage and head up to the city and meet over at the southern stairs we just talked about. We're actually at the southwest corner of the Temple Mount, where the western wall meets up with the southern wall. Here we find the remains of Jerusalem's main street running the length of the western wall about 1 kilometer long from the late Second Temple period. This street was paved with flagstones and edged with curbstones, and it had 2 large drainage channels running beneath it. This would have been a busy place with shops open on both sides of the street, and it reminds me of the streets we saw at Beit Shean. Just around the corner, we come to the southern stairs. In biblical times, this led to massive double gates on top where pilgrims would enter the Temple Mount. Mikvahs would have been present for worshipers to bathe in for ritual baths, as well as baptismal pools if they didn't go to the pool of Siloam. This staircase is massive, and you wonder how many hundreds or thousands of people could be on here at one time. This staircase was used by rabbis as a place to teach from above while overlooking everyone on the stairs. In fact, this could have been the place where Jesus was teaching in Matthew 21, verse 23, when the Jewish priests and elders demanded to know what authority he was doing this in. As I've mentioned before, just standing in the place where Jesus stood is exciting, frightening, and humbling all at the same time. The view from on top of the stairs is amazing. The city of David just below us to the south, the Mount of Olives to the east. Sometimes all you can say is, wow. The city of Jerusalem is divided into 4 quarters: the Muslim quarter, the Christian quarter, the Armenian quarter, and the Jewish quarter. Our next adventure is in the Armenian quarter as we visit the traditional site of the Last Supper room. According to the Gospel of John, chapter 13, this is where Jesus shared a final meal with his disciples before being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is where Jesus washed his disciples' feet. This is where Jesus told Peter that he would deny him 3 times and foretold of Judas's betrayal. And this is also where the Holy Spirit descended upon the disciples and fellow believers after Jesus' ascension on the day of Pentecost. My first impression of this building was, wow, that looks amazing. The architecture is definitely from the Byzantine era, and the Last Supper room is on the 2nd floor. Interestingly enough, the ground floor is the location of the tomb of King David. However, the Bible tells us he is buried somewhere in the city of David close by. Now you may be asking yourself, how can the Last Supper room still exist if the Romans destroyed the entire city in 70 AD? That's a great question, and the reason this is considered a B site instead of an A site in archaeological criteria, meaning they don't have absolute proof that it is, but there's plenty of information to substantiate that it very well could be. Could this building still be standing since Jesus' time on earth? Well, at that time, the Bible tells us that this was someone's house and not a church. This is important because our guide Iran explained to us that the Romans didn't allow churches to be built when they were in power. It helps to have a complete understanding of the history of all churches in Israel. So here goes. The first churches in Israel were built in the 4th century during the Byzantine era. The Muslims came over in the 7th and 8th centuries and destroyed those churches. The Crusaders came in during the 11th and 12th centuries and rebuilt those churches. The Muslims came back in the 13th century and destroyed those churches again. It wasn't until the second half of the 19th century when European Christian influences were able to rebuild those churches once again. The fact that this building wasn't a church may have saved its life initially, but it's also important to know that Muslims see Jesus as one of their prophets, and they believe in the Last Supper event as well. Because of that, they never destroyed this building. Hence, it could be the original building. The inside of the Last Supper room is beautiful, but it doesn't look anything like it did in Jesus' time. However, it is a unique combination of several cultures, and I think it also reflects the religious tensions that have fought over this room for many centuries. In today's world, you'd probably fire your interior decorator for this, as the pointy windowsills are the Gothic Christian style, the window panes are very Muslim, the pointy arches at the ceiling are from the Crusader era, and the walls contain Arab calligraphy. It goes together perfectly. I never envisioned this room would be this size, but the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, says that this was a large room upstairs of someone's house. And in Acts 1, verse 15, Luke mentions that 120 people were meeting here. So it makes perfect sense that this room is as big as it is. Our next stop is in the Jewish Quarter, a busy part of town and a great place to people watch and grab some lunch. Oh man, that sounds good right now. The Jewish Quarter is an incredible place filled with rich history, archaeological sites, and fascinating museums, along with the traditional sites like the Western Wall and the Temple Mount, which we'll be visiting soon. You know, being of superior intellect has its pros and cons. But what I found most satisfying about the Jewish Quarter was digging into the rich cultural history, studying the Hebrew language, and placing myself in the shoes of religious scholars. What is going on? I'm so sorry. Let me start this over again. The Jewish Quarter is full of beautiful synagogues and ruins of lavish houses and incredible artifacts, and it's the food. That's what I love the most. It's the food. Well, I'm glad we got that out of the way, and I do feel much better. But seriously, the food is great here. The most enchanting street in Old Jerusalem is the Cardo, taken from the word cardio, meaning the lifeblood of the city. Roughly 1,500 years ago, this was one of Jerusalem's busiest roads. These shop spaces date back to the Byzantine era, and as you can see, this is where the action is. Gift shops galore for the tourist, of course, but also everyday needs for those who live in the city. Whatever you do, do not pass up the spice market. You have to find room in your suitcase for the chicken seasoning and the rice seasoning, and anything else they tell you is good. You won't be disappointed. And yes, of course, they have all the fixins for an awesome chicken shawarma. Within the Jewish Quarter, there's a section called the Herodian Quarter, an opulent residential neighborhood dating back to the days of Herod the Great's dynasty. When the archaeologists discovered this property, they labeled it as a palatial mansion and went so far as to claim that this could very well have been the residence of the high priest Joseph Caiaphas. Now this has caused quite a stir since there has already been an archaeological find claiming to be the residence of Caiaphas. Back on the Mount of Olives, we saw a church off to our left, which is the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. This is known as the traditional site of Caiaphas' house. A Byzantine shrine was erected at this location in 457 AD, dedicated to Peter's repentance. In fact, Gallicantu means cock's crow, referring to Peter denying Jesus 3 times. However, this location was known as downtown Jerusalem, or where the common people lived. Certainly not where someone like the high priest would live. He was one of the richest men in town. So how did this come about? Well, after the Six-Day War in 1967, and after 19 years of Jordanian occupation, the Jews were finally able to return to their city of Jerusalem and found the Jewish quarter crumbling and in ruins. Fortunately, the Israeli government realized that this was a historical window of opportunity for an archaeological excavation on an unprecedented large-scale effort, and one of the gems they found was the Herodian quarter. After descending just 10 feet or so, we find ourselves in a 6,500 square foot Roman villa. Lavish houses with walls decorated by colorful frescoes and mosaics. Imported clay and glass kitchenware have been found here, suggesting unusual wealth for these residents. Three inkwells have been discovered here, suggesting someone had a significant administration role. And the many ritual baths found here suggest again that these folks had extreme wealth. So is this Joseph Caiaphas' house? Well, in an archaeological site next to this mansion, 2 stone weights were found with the Aramaic inscription of Cathros, a wealthy family of priests, one of which just happens to be Caiaphas' brother. It's quite likely that the 2 related priestly families lived next door to each other. The most intriguing discovery in this mansion is a room resembling an exceptionally large reception hall. This would be a perfect room for the Sanhedrin to meet in and interrogate Jesus after his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. We are standing in the courtyard where Peter was warming himself by the fire, trying to listen to what's going on in the room on the other side. Our guide Iran is posing as Jesus in the big reception hall room, showing how Peter and he could have made eye contact when the rooster crowed after Peter had denied him for the 3rd time. It kind of sends chills down your back. Another convention artifact for declaring this as Caiaphas' house is this hole in the ground. But for what purpose? There is no jail available, so where would they put Jesus overnight before sending him to Pontius Pilate? This would be the perfect place. Place a lid on it overnight, and in the morning, throw a rope down to allow Jesus to climb back up. We may never know for sure if this was Joseph Caiaphas' house, but it sure seems to fit that of someone in his standing. This is a really great tour with incredible history and beautiful artifacts to enjoy. Without a doubt, the most heartbreaking and life-impacting exhibit is Yad Vashem's World Holocaust Remembrance Center. Now, I didn't say museum. There are Holocaust museums all over the world, of course, but the Holocaust is just part of this Remembrance Center. In fact, when you first enter the exhibit, you are viewing a film of what Jewish life was like before the war. Their joy, their families, the lives they had carved out for themselves. See, to understand the magnitude of their loss, you first need to understand what they had before, when everything was suddenly taken away. I know we'd like to believe that this is ancient history and that we are so far beyond the evil that was in man's heart so long ago. And yet, just 80 short years ago, the Holocaust was entering its unimaginable peak of horror as the Nazis and their allies murdered over 2.5 million Jews in just 250 days. That's 10,000 Jews being murdered every day. The word Holocaust in Latin means burnt offering, which is a horrible name for the atrocities that took place. The Jews like to use the Hebrew word Shoah, which means total annihilation. When you search the Yad Vashem's World Holocaust Remembrance Center webpage, you'll see the word Shoah mentioned throughout. The building is in the shape of a triangle, and it's designed like a maze. As everyone goes through the memorial at their own pace, it's very easy to get lost and separated from your party. And that is by design. What's the message? That's how the Jews felt, always looking for a place to hide, not knowing where everybody was, trying to find some place they could squeeze into as they're being hunted. One of the exhibits in the memorial is the Hall of Names, a repository for the names of the millions of Shoah victims. The general public has been entering information about the Shoah victims since 1968 through a form called the Pages of Testimony. Today, there is a sophisticated digitized database for collecting that information. The goal of the Hall of Names is to associate a name to each victim. As of today, there are still nearly 2 million names unaccounted for. The Holocaust murdered almost 7 million Jews by the Nazis and their allies during the Second World War. The persecution started when the Nazi Party came into power in 1933. The annihilation started in 1939, and it didn't stop until the Nazis had lost the war in 1945. The purpose of this memorial is, of course, to mourn the loss of these people and to contemplate how this could happen, and to give a voice and a face to the victims, allowing them to tell their own stories. But its purpose is also to educate us and to teach us that we need to do everything we can to prevent future genocides. Our guide Iran told us about his grandparents' experience in surviving the Holocaust. I won't tell his story here as it's his story to tell, but I wonder how many other Jewish families today have grandparents that had a previous family before the war. A wife, a husband, children, only to survive the Holocaust and then realize their entire family was wiped out, and then started over by creating a new family. This became a great motivator of the Jewish survivors after the war. Produced the very thing that Hitler hated the most: more Jewish children. Because children were targeted during the Shoah, there is a children's memorial located here as well. The children's memorial is situated in a cave, and the design is purposefully dark and eerie. And you find yourself asking, what could these Holocaust children have been feeling? As you enter the cave, the first thing you encounter are photographs of children's faces. The purity and innocence of childhood staring directly before you. Kids of every ethnicity who had the one sin of a Jewish faith were targeted by the Nazis. Just around the corner is a memorial featuring 4 candles in the center of a chamber, which are reflected by 500 mirrors, creating the effect of a star-studded sky. These lights symbolize the souls of each of the 1.5 million Jewish children who died during the Holocaust. Every child's name is called out, along with their country of origin, in Yiddish, Hebrew, and English. It reminds us that every name has a story.
Hannah Rivka Yosefovich, 5 years old, Hungary.
And you have to wonder, what stories were never able to be told?
6 years old, France.
Svetlana Mishlimovich, 3 years old, Russia.
As I mentioned before, the Remembrance Center is much more than a Holocaust museum. I want to end this segment on a positive note because there were heroes during this time as well. In the Garden of the Righteous, the names of non-Jews who saved the lives of Jews during the Shoah are engraved on the walls. Some 27,000 names have been added so far. Names like Irena Sendler, a Polish Catholic social worker who worked in the Polish underground and convinced Jewish mothers to give her their child for a chance to live. Over 2,300 Jewish mothers handed their children over to her to be smuggled out of the ghetto. Irena found foster families and wrote down each child's family history on paper and buried it in a jar. She would be caught by the Gestapo and tortured for nearly a year by breaking her arms and legs to give up the location of the children. Just before her execution, she was rescued by the Polish underground. Irena came back to the foster families and was able to tell the children who their parents were. None of their parents survived the Holocaust, but she gave the children their identity. And then there's a Swedish diplomat named Raoul Wallenberg who saved 4,000 Jews by providing fake and real diplomatic papers against the will of his own government. He literally stopped trains on the way to Auschwitz. In 1948, he was murdered in a Russian gulag. About 350,000 people are alive in Israel today because of Raoul Wallenberg. And then there's the Schindlers. You've probably watched the movie about them, but here was a couple about as pro-German as you could be. But when they saw the Jewish people, something changed in Emily and Oscar's heart. The Schindlers took hundreds of frozen Jews stuffed in cattle trains and gave them food and tea. They nursed them and took care of them and started calling them my Jews. Risking his own life, Oscar would travel and warn Jewish leaders of the Nazis' plan. Well, this is an incredible place. The memorial raises more questions than it provides answers for, and that's a good thing. We have to ask ourselves, are we more aware today of the atrocities across the world than we were in the 40s? Or are we like the Polish who said, we didn't know what the smell was? Or the Germans who said, we didn't know where the Jews disappeared to? Or the people in Holland who said, we didn't know what would happen to the people whose names we provided to the authorities. I was watching a film about Raoul Wallenberg, and there's an excellent quote that I'd like to close with. And it goes like this: one person, just one person, with the compassion to care and the courage to act, can not only confront evil, but resist evil, and thereby transform history. After the Six-Day War ended, visiting the Temple Mount became available to non-Muslims each week from Sunday to Thursday at prescribed times through a gate near the Western Wall. As we walk up the ramp to the Temple Mount gate, you can see the Western Wall down below and to our left. It's really an interesting view that you can't get anywhere else. The first building we walk by is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was built originally in 710 AD, 19 years after the Dome of the Rock was built. We'll talk more about this mosque in a few minutes. I've already talked about the history of the Temple Mount, so let's talk about what's been happening since 1967. After the Six-Day War, the Israeli secular leadership decided to give the Temple Mount to the Islamic religious authorities to be managed. Now, why would they do that? Well, number one, they didn't want to start World War III. And number two, religious Jews are not permitted on the Temple Mount anyway, by their own leaders. 99% of the rabbis forbid their people to go up there because they don't want to step on holy ground, as they don't know for sure where the first and second temples were located. The religious Zionist Jews who do go up there will always walk on the outside edges of the Temple Mount, never close to the middle, and they will always be barefoot because it is a holy place. Let's talk religion and politics for a few minutes. This should be good. Now, admittedly, the following is from the Jewish perspective, and prior to this tour, I had very little knowledge about the origins of the Muslim religion or the Quran. So let's start with this. Jerusalem is never mentioned in the Quran. So why is it important to the Muslims? Their holy cities are Mecca and Medina. So what's up? Here's some history. The Quran was finished being written the same year Muhammad died in 632 AD. This is not a coincidence since Muhammad is their leader. About 30 years later, the rulers of the Muslim Empire changed their capital from Mecca to Damascus in 661 AD. It was the richest city in the world at that time. At the same time of moving their capital to Damascus, their armies were busy conquering Spain. So the female-to-male ratio back home in Damascus was 20-1, and everyone was, in today's terms, billionaires, as all the loot from previous wars was stored there. As you can imagine, it was a party town. Lots of idolatry, alcoholism, loose living, all things forbidden by the Quran. And even murder. as war between the Shiites and the Sunnis had just started up over who the successor to Muhammad should be. So how does that work? Well, the Quran states that if you come every year to Mecca via the pilgrimage called Hajj and go around the Kaaba stone, the goddess of fertility, all your sins would be forgiven. So everything you did last year would be wiped clean. However, while their army was in Spain, the rulers and people in Damascus couldn't make the pilgrimage to Mecca because the Bedouins would kill them along their journey. Their National Guard left in Damascus was a bunch of drunk men who couldn't fight, so what could they do? They came up with Hadith, a legend or addition to the Quran 100 years after it had been written. The legend is that Muhammad was transported on a horse with wings with the face of a beautiful female to Jerusalem from Mecca in one night, where he worshipped in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and then ascended to heaven from the Dome of the Rock, where supposedly his footprint resides. Muhammad met all the prophets in heaven and prayed before all of them, then returned to Mecca on his flying horse. Now, when I say he prayed before them, that means he prayed first. In Islam, the one who prays first is the ruler. If anyone prays before the ruler prays, it is considered a rebellion. In the legend, Muhammad prayed before Jesus, Moses, Elijah, before any other prophet. This is why Islam believes it has the right to abolish Judaism and abolish Christianity, because Muhammad is the ruler above all. Now, because of this new legend, those in Damascus could travel safely to Jerusalem and worship in the Al-Aqsa Mosque as a substitute for the holy sites in Mecca and Medina. Let's bring Jerusalem into today's world. No Arabic leader has ever ruled from here. It's just not an important city to them. When the Jordanians were here between 1948 and 1967, they never thought of making Jerusalem the capital of Palestine. See, Jerusalem only becomes holy to the Muslims when it's not in Muslims' hands. It's a political issue and nothing else. There's an interesting discrimination taking place here. Muslim leadership today denies the existence of the first and second Jewish temples here. This is a dangerous thing the Muslims are doing. They are attempting to erase the Jewish and Christian history here on the Temple Mount. For hundreds of years, this has never been in dispute until the last few decades. They also deny the existence of the Holocaust, part of the experience we just visited. It's interesting that Muslims can enter the Temple Mount 24/7 through any one of 11 gates available to them. However, for non-Muslims, access is only available through one gate near the western wall, and you can only be up there for a 4-hour window. Non-Muslims face strict security measures, such as you can't bring a Bible or any religious artifact to the Temple Mount, whereas any Muslim can bring a Quran or anything they would like to bring to the western wall 24/7. Imagine what would happen if roles reversed and the Jews forbid Muslims to go to the wall for just 1 hour a week. As an interesting side note, UNESCO, the United Nations Culture and Education Committee, announced in 2017 that Israel has no legal or historical rights anywhere in Jerusalem, basically saying there is no connection between the Jews and Jerusalem. The United States left UNESCO in December of 2018, but 22 countries, including France, supported this announcement. It will be very interesting to watch these countries interact going forward, and the pressure the world puts on our current administration to rejoin UNESCO and the ramifications of doing that. Now, that was a lot of talk about politics and religion, but being here is awesome, and the Temple Mount grounds are gorgeous. It's beautiful to walk around, and I would highly recommend coming here to anyone traveling to Jerusalem. And remember that 6,000-year window of history I mentioned a while back? Well, it started right here. We came onto the Temple Mount at the southwest corner, and as we walk along the eastern border, we get a great view of the eastern gate. Now, I noticed they have 2 guards up there, but I don't think they're looking for Christ's return. They actually have a great view of the Kidron Valley and the Mount of Olives and can monitor any activity from up here. To give you a little perspective of where we're at, this is a map of Jerusalem in Old Testament times. Today, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is here, and of course the Dome of the Rock is right here where the temples used to be. We're standing at the Eastern Gate right now, and we're about to leave the Temple Mount through the Lion's Gate and head to the Pool of Bethesda, or as some like to say, the Pool of Bethesda, located in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem. This gate used to be called the Sheep's Gate in biblical times, as this is where the sheep were brought in to be sacrificed at the temple. Also note where the Antonia Fortress is located. This is where Pontius Pilate hung out, and where we'll be starting our journey down the Via Dolorosa. You know, it's interesting. We tend to think biblical times were just slightly more modern than the caveman days, but obviously the Roman architecture at this time was quite advanced. When I hear about the Pool of Bethesda, my mind thinks of a small pond with people laying all around the water on mats or something to lay on, but the Gospel of John chapter 5 describes a pool with 5 covered porches or porticos with crowds of people wanting to be healed. When we were at the Israel Museum, there was a model of the Pool of Bethesda, and it was beautiful. Or should I say pools, as there were 2, an upper and a lower. Folks, we would pay money today to visit these pools. As you can imagine, the pools of Bethesda don't look anything like they did back in biblical times. Along with the destruction of churches throughout the centuries, other structures faced the same fate. It stayed hidden until 1888. The arch that we see once supported a bridge from a Byzantine church that was built over the pool. When the site was first discovered, archaeologists only noticed one pool. However, 100 years later, when the pool was more carefully evaluated, archaeologists discovered that there were 2 pools. They found the pools were separated by a wall, and this is what gives us the 5 covered colonnades or porches, which matches the Gospel of John. The lower pool was used as a mikveh, while the upper pool was a reservoir that supplied the lower pool with clean water. One of the things that have been discovered here are stairs, similar to what we saw at the Pool of Siloam, which means this pool was used for baptismals as well. Some people believe that the upper pool is mentioned in the Old Testament in Isaiah 7:3, where Isaiah and his son were told to meet Ahaz at the upper pool. The story we all know is about a lame man that had been at this pool for 38 years. The Pool of Bethesda was known as the healing pool, and the belief was that an angel would come and stir the water, creating bubbles, and the first one to get in after the water started bubbling would be healed. Jesus approached the man and simply asked if he wanted to be healed. The man didn't say yes, but complained that he could never be the first one in the water because he was lame. Jesus simply said, "Stand up, pick up your mat, and walk." And of course, he was instantly healed. Now, Jesus performed this miracle on the Sabbath, which opened up a whole new can of worms for the Jewish leaders to worry about. We won't go through that here, but it's a great story that continues in the Gospel of John. We headed back through the Lion's Gate and found ourselves on the Via Dolorosa, the path Jesus walked to his crucifixion. The Via Dolorosa is not a street, but a route that travels over several streets, starting at the Antonia Fortress and ending at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The entire route is about 3/8 of a mile long. The Via Dolorosa is known as the Way of Suffering and is marked by the 14 stations of the cross, which capture events that took place along Jesus' path. However, only 9 of the 14 stations of the cross are mentioned in the Bible. The other 5 events are from handed-down traditions. Now, it doesn't mean they're not true, they're just not recorded in the Bible. One thing we realize quickly is that the Via Dolorosa is not an archaeological journey, but rather it's identifying with the suffering of Jesus. We already know that the real street Jesus walked on is about 20 feet below where we're standing, but we are in and on the right historical location. As we're standing outside of the old Antonia Fortress, we are at Station of the Cross number 1. In Jesus' time, we would actually be standing outside of the walls of the city, which ran right up against the Antonia Fortress. I mentioned earlier that a high school now resides in this location. The Gospel of Luke, chapters 22 and 23, give a good detailed account of what took place on the day of Jesus' crucifixion. What stood out to me when I studied it was that Jesus didn't travel in a linear line from station 1 to station 14. There was a lot of back and forth travel between Caiaphas' house, Pontius Pilate's house, the Antonia fortress, and Herod Antipas's palace, who happened to be in Jerusalem at this time for Passover. It's also obvious that Jesus was already pretty beat up by the time he appeared before Pontius Pilate early in the morning. The night before at Caiaphas' house, the guards had blindfolded him, mocked him, and beat him. Let's talk about how strong many of the traditions are surrounding the events of that day. As we look up the street, we see an archway with two windows known as the Ecce Homo, which in Latin translates to "Behold the Man." According to tradition, Pontius Pilate was in one of those windows and Jesus was in the other, as Pilate presented Jesus to the people below. We're standing in the place where the angry mob would have been shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Can you imagine the chaos and the mob mentality that would take over in an instant when a crowd gets incited on a narrow street like this? It would be insane. For a reality check, the event is true, but that arch didn't exist in Jesus' time. It was built by Caesar Hadrian about 100 years later as he started rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. He named it the Victory Gate, and there were 3 arches in total, but only half of one is still visible today. But I think it gives us a good idea of where Pontius Pilate's house was. But that arch is still known today as Ecce Homo. Station of the Cross number 2 is the scourging floor, better known as the Sanctuary of the Flagellation. After Jesus appeared in front of Pontius Pilate, he was brought here. Pilate initially just wanted Jesus whipped and released. In fact, in Matthew 27, Pilate's wife told him to leave that innocent man alone, as she had a terrible nightmare the previous night about Jesus. But in the end, Pilate gave in to peer pressure and condemned Jesus to death. The Romans used local priests and the local temples to control the people and protect their empire. Crucifixion was a horrible way to die, and it was really about creating a spectacle to make an example of that person and place fear into the hearts and minds of the people. A person being flagellated would most likely be stripped naked for public humiliation. Jagged metal hooks known as scorpions at the end of a scourge or whip were used to quickly remove skin without breaking the bones, so that the person could carry their own cross to the crucifixion site. Jesus was so thoroughly tortured that he couldn't carry his cross the entire way. Pastor Ray gave us a great word on what we just heard and experienced to put it in perspective.
Then I thought, as Ron was speaking, I thought about the importance that he talked about the bones not being broken and all of that. And I thought how amazing it is, in my opinion, that they're not taking his life, he's giving it freely. I think that's the key for me. He willingly gives his life for us today. And so when Ron adds all of these tremendous details to what we know in Scripture, it just makes the reality of the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross and his resurrection that much more powerful.
As we were standing outside the Ecce Homo monastery, a group came by carrying a cross and singing, and it was actually very moving to hear their voices and see the compassion in their eyes. It's quite an experience to walk down this road, imagining hundreds, if not thousands of people filling each square inch that day. At a certain point along the Via Dolorosa, we come to a T in the road, and you have to make a decision whether you want to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to the left, where some Christians, including most Catholics, believe Jesus was crucified and buried, or turn right to visit the Garden Tomb, where other Christians believe Jesus was crucified at Golgotha and buried nearby. Stations of the Cross number 3 and number 4 are located here at this intersection, and they depict where Jesus fell for the first time and where Jesus saw his mother Mary. Now again, we know that the real street Jesus walked on is 20 feet below us, but traditions are so strong, people believe that these events took place at these exact locations. But like I said, this is not an archaeological journey to find Jesus' exact footsteps. It's about understanding the suffering he went through for us. We're visiting the Garden Tomb, so we turn right and head to the Damascus Gate. This is really a nice walk with shops lined on both sides of the street and lots of locals doing their shopping. After a short walk from the Damascus Gate, we arrive at the Garden Tomb site, home of Skull Hill and the Garden Tomb itself. The gardens here are beautiful, and they provide a gorgeous pathway as we walk towards Skull Hill, also known as Golgotha. To give credence to this location, a wine press was found here dating back to the Roman era, so it's very possible that this was a vineyard at Jesus' time. The Gospel of John, chapter 19, says that Jesus was crucified at a place called Place of the Skull, or Golgotha. This is a picture of Skull Hill dating back around 1880. Tradition says that this site was used for executing convicted criminals by the Jews. Stoning someone to death was a popular method of execution, and the soil here is very rocky, so an ample supply of ammunition was available. Many biblical scholars believe that when Stephen was stoned to death, they led him out through the Damascus Gate. Acts chapter 7 says the Jewish leaders rushed at him and dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. Well, as we know, Saul, the soon-to-be Apostle Paul, was a witness there. This very well could have been the place where Stephen was killed. So how do we go from stoning to crucifixions? Well, when the Romans took over Jerusalem, they would have taken over all the official buildings, including the prisons and the execution sites, and their favorite method of execution was by crucifixion. The Damascus Gate Road ran right by Skull Hill, so crucifixions would have been very visible to the public. Today, the area below Skull Hill is a bus depot. After some 2,000 years of erosion and the rumblings from constant bus traffic, rocks have fallen and there's no plans to repair it at this time. It's not quite the imposing sight it used to be, but it still stirs your heart knowing what very well may have taken place here. The Garden Tomb is just a 2 to 3 minute relaxing walk from Golgotha. The gardens just seem to usher you right in. The Garden Tomb is a simple tomb cut out of rock. The environment they've created here is quiet and worshipful, and you get a sense that if you could travel back in time, you could see a small burial party carrying the body of Jesus from the cross into this tomb. Is this Christ's tomb? Well, I love how this restored garden reflects the Bible's description of a skull-shaped hill, a garden, and an empty Jewish tomb. Could the tomb be at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Well, there's evidence that could very well be the place too. The Garden Tomb is not regal, it's not ornate, and you know what else it's not? It's not occupied, and that is the most incredible part. And the same goes for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There's no one in the tomb. He has risen. Well, I think this is the best possible place to end this video. Jerusalem, you have blown my mind. Wow. Those who were part of this tour would tell you that I've only been able to capture but a small window of our experiences. If you've never been to Israel, you have to go. You have to experience, smell, and yes, taste your way through this country. It's an experience I know I will never forget, and I know the same will be true for you as well. And a shout out to this gang with whom we had the privilege to travel with. I can't tell you how much fun we had. A big thanks to Pastors Ray and Mary for organizing this trip, and of course our guide Iran, who made the Bible and this country come alive for us. Wow, I almost teared up there. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this video series. If you did, please give me a thumbs up down below. Leave your comments. I'd love to hear about your experiences in Jerusalem. And consider subscribing to my channel. I got some more things coming up as well. Until then, thank you so much. God bless you all. Palestine had attacked Israel once again. One more. Once again. What am I going to say? And attacked over 50 times. That's not helpful. What we do know is that she never had a child. I was watching a film about Raoul Wallenberg, and there's an excellent quote that I'd like to close with. And it goes like this. I have no idea. But what I found most satisfying, being of superior intellect. You know, being of superior intellect. Being of superior intellect. Being of superior intellect. Has us being of superior, superior intellect. I can't say superior.